Hello and welcome to Hot Topic Election Special. I'm Hugh Riches. This time we've invited parliamentary candidates for the constituency of East Yorkshire. Only one was available, so I'm particularly grateful to Kevin Hickson of the Labour Party. Kevin, thank you very much for coming in.
Not at all. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your programme.
We have a little bit of luxury, since there is only one of you here, that we can get to know the candidate a little bit more. What's your background?
Well, I was born and brought up in Cheshire, educated locally, went to Warwick University and ended a PhD at Southampton University.
You're Dr. Hickson?
Dr. Hickson, yes. A lecturer at Liverpool University, senior lecturer now in politics. I've been there for over a decade. I've been getting more and more, obviously been interested in politics for a long time as a teacher, but for a few years now I've been thinking that in order to make a difference you need to be in the political system. So I'm the leader of the town council in Crewe at the moment, and a councillor at Cheshire East Unitary Council. Been coming over to East Yorkshire for many years now because I've got friends who live there, know the constituency very well, and I was privileged to have been selected as their candidate.
There is a point that you're an academic background. It's similar for journalists as well. There's a point where you lose your grumbling rights about politics unless you actually want to take part and get in there yourself, isn't there?
Well, fortunately in lectures it's still room for free speech, so I've been able to put forward my arguments, but also to encourage others as a liberal academic, really.
And why? What attracted you to the Labour? You call yourself a liberal academic, but you're standing for the Labour Party. Yes,
absolutely. Well, I've been Labour all my life, really, certainly since I was getting interested in politics. Because my values most closely resemble those of the Labour Party. I believe in a society marked by social justice, by compassion and by greater equality. And those are the values that historically and at the moment the Labour Party represents. So I'm pleased to be standing on a Labour platform.
Well then, since you're a political scholar, I can put this question to you in a rather abstract way. You said that Labour Party attracts you for what you call social justice. Mm-hmm. French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity we can take for granted. Liberty and equality, you can't have both at the same time.
Firstly, I disagree. I don't think we can take fraternity for granted. I think we live in a society at the moment where individuals don't live in active communities. I think those community bonds have been eroded to some extent. But I believe that if you want to have effective liberty, then you've got to be equal. That if you're born into poorer backgrounds, then you don't have the same liberties as those who are born into wealthier backgrounds. So I think the more equality there is in society, the more liberty there is as well.
But then having been born, one continues one's life, one's career with such talents and abilities as one has. Mm-hmm. And some people are going to be magnificent brain surgeons and concert violinists, and some people are going to be not very good at anything like me. Surely it's right that the concert violinists and the brain surgeons are much better rewarded and that they are at liberty to keep their rewards rather than have it all taken away by the taxman.
You're absolutely right in the sense that some people have better talents. They're not necessarily entirely responsible themselves for those talents. Some of them have had fortunate family backgrounds and so on and so forth. So we need to compensate for that in terms of the gap between the rich and the poor. Also current levels of inequality are very divisive. Not only socially unjust but also undermine economic performance. We see the bonus culture, for instance, in the City of London and the disastrous consequences that had, that we need to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor for the sake of economic efficiency and social justice.
So you're talking about an equality of opportunity rather than necessarily an equality of results?
Yes, I don't think anyone believes that everyone should have exactly the same in terms of income and wealth. Obviously there is room for some inequalities, but those inequalities at the moment, in my view, are too broad and they need to be narrowed. So I do believe in equality of opportunity, I do believe in a meritocratic society, but also believe beyond that there ought to be a narrowing of the gap between the richest and the poorest.
That puts you fairly well on the left of the Labour Party, doesn't it? That puts you fairly well into the old Labour tradition.
I think it puts me in the same position as my leader, Ed Miliband, who has expressed those views himself. It used to be the case that those on the left of the party were those who believed in unilateral disarmament or withdrawal from the European Union or extensive nationalisation. I don't believe in any of those things necessarily. I do believe that there needs to be more progressive taxation, there needs to be more redistribution, that the gap, as I said, between the rich and the poor needs to be narrowed.
You mentioned the European Union there. That's probably more of an issue in this election than it has been in previous elections. And again, the Conservative Party is fairly divided about that. Other parties take different views. What's your view of the European Union?
Well, my view on the European Union is that we are right to be a member. I believe that the economic benefits of membership are very clear. I also believe that, although not many people make this argument explicitly anymore, the founding fathers of the European Union, of the European Economic Community, as it then was, believed that there needed to be integration between the nation states to avoid the rise of nationalism, because Europe had gone through two world wars as a result of nationalism. So European integration is a way of trying to avoid those national tensions. And I think that one of the worries at the moment is the rise of nationalism across Europe. We see it in all countries, certainly with UKIP in Britain, who I think are a dangerous political force. But we see more extreme right-wing variations of nationalism on the continent. We can't tackle geopolitical problems like the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine on our own. We need to be part of a larger entity to do that. And I also think that we need to be part of a larger entity to tackle major problems that we have at the moment, such as global warming. That doesn't stop at national boundaries, it transcends national boundaries. And the only way we can get effective action to tackle those problems is through being part of the European Union. So I believe in the European Union. I think we're right to be a member. It's not perfect as it is. I think it does need reform. And there does need to be a referendum, and the Labour Party has pledged to a referendum should there be a further increase in powers.
You mention nationalism there and say that it's something to be resisted, something to be fought against. What is the fault in the reasoning of nationalism? Where is nationalism in error?
Well, I think we're all patriots to some extent. We all cheer on our national sporting teams, we all cheer on our athletes at the Olympic Games and so on. And I think it's quite right to be patriotic. And for some forms of nationalism, not all forms of nationalism, but certainly the more extreme, not only say that they are different, but they are superior to other nations. And that creates conflict between nations. I think that's where nationalism becomes a dangerous force. Really.
But how is nationalism even a political argument? And I don't mean to be dismissing it in any way at all. I'm just being curious about it. In that equation that I asked about originally, equality and liberty, what is the relationship between the citizen and the state, between the governed and the governing? That is the fundamental question of politics. The identity, the location of where that government occurs, or the place of birth of who is being governed and who's doing the governing, these seem irrelevant to the questions that are at the heart of politics. That's coincidences of birth, as you mentioned before.
Yeah, well, those values that you mentioned of fraternity, liberty and equality, of course, transcend nation states. And to that extent, nationalism isn't important. But we see increasingly that nationalism has become a force. I think people are unsettled by the economic changes that we've had over the last decade or so. And people look sometimes for scapegoats. And unfortunately, that's where nationalism can become a popular force in terms of targeting immigrants and so on.
I've asked so much about nationalism because there's a possibility, even though your leader Ed Miliband denies it, that even on a supply and confidence arrangement, you might be in some sort of agreement with a nationalist party, with specifically the Scottish nationalists, after the general election.
Well, I'm campaigning in East Yorkshire to win the seat, and I'm helping to campaign nationally to make sure that Labour gets a majority. That's the outcome that I want. On May the 7th, the Labour majority, because as I said, I believe in Labour's values. I believe they're particularly prescient at the moment.
Well, we know that your everybody's going to say they're campaigning for an overall majority. It would be mad not to, but it would be equally mad not to accept the fact that there's at least a good probability that nobody will have an overall majority. And so that's what I just want to ask you about, is if your leader has said there's no possibility of coalition with the Scottish nationalists, but another arrangement, usually known as a supply and confidence arrangement, in which they don't take a part in a Labour government, but they do vote with Labour to give you the majority in the House of Commons. That is a prospect that, after what you've just said about nationalism, must fill you with dread.
Well, as I said, I'm not going to get involved in those particular issues because I'm campaigning for a Labour victory. I still think there's all to play for in the general election this year. I still think it's possible to get a Labour majority, and that's what I'm committed to.
OK, well, that's very much the party line. Thank you very much for that. Specifically in East Yorkshire, it's a very agricultural constituency that you have. And there we might, there's an aspect of Europe and migration involved in that as well. But the farmers are dependent, absolutely dependent on Europe, aren't they? Because of the subsidies for the agricultural subsidies.
Well, indeed, in a constituency like East Yorkshire, withdrawal from the European Union, which is what what UKIP and sections of the Conservative Party now explicitly want, would be disastrous for those jobs, not just in the rural areas, but also in the towns that depend on trade with Europe.
What would a Labour government be able to do for East Yorkshire? East Yorkshire is a fairly prosperous part of the world at the moment. What would a Labour government do that the present government can't?
Well, East Yorkshire is a beautiful part of the world in many ways. It's got some wonderful countryside.
It's not a government that makes a place beautiful.
But it's that belies the fact that there are major problems. There are issues in terms of pay. East Yorkshire is a black spot in terms of low wages. There is problems with cuts in healthcare nationally, and that's impacting in East Yorkshire. There are problems in terms of education because East Yorkshire has one of the lowest funding arrangements for schools under this government. So those are all issues on which I'm campaigning.
Is that the lowest funding in terms of schools per pupil or just as an absolute?
As a pupil ratio, it's one of the worst arrangements in the country. And as I said, those are issues on which I'm campaigning. I want to see investment into the healthcare. I want to see improvements in education. If I'm elected as a candidate in May, I will be campaigning for a living wage in East Yorkshire, which is crucial to a lot of people who work there.
If you have a living wage, you raise the minimum payment, the minimum wage, is that not going to put people out of work who are taking the low-paid agricultural jobs that employ so many people in the constituency?
Not at all. And there has been an issue in terms of agricultural pay in particular because this current government has abolished the Agricultural Wages Board, which protected what historically has been a very under-unionised sector. And the current MP voted in favour of that arrangement, and that has impacted.
Kevin, we'll come back and try and talk about agriculture and pay and employment a little bit in the second half. But for the moment, thank you very much. Please join us again after this break. Welcome back to Hot Topic Election Special, this time talking to a candidate for East Yorkshire. He happens to be the Labour candidate, Kevin Hickson. Kevin, thanks very much again. We were talking about wages, we were talking about money. Let's talk about the economy. The Labour Party wants to pay down the deficit, the Conservative Party wants to pay down the debt and the deficit. Now, it just makes common sense that you want to get out of debt, don't you?
Absolutely. We both want to get out of debt. The argument is exactly how this is the case, and unfortunately the Conservatives have made the claim now, which hasn't been true for a long time, that the deficit was caused by the last Labour government. This wasn't true. Up until 2007, the deficit was manageable. The deficit then increased as a result of the banking crisis and the need to kick-start the economy. And the last Labour government was repaying the deficit at a faster rate than the coalition government has managed. And there were signs of economic recovery before the 2010 general election, but for dogmatic reasons, for ideological reasons, as far as I can see, George Osborne as Chancellor has slashed public spending, slashed the deficit, and the consequence of that was to choke off any of those green shoots of recovery that were present before the 2010 election, and the deficit has been harder to repay. So I want to see the running down of the deficit. I want to see the running down of national debt, but the way of doing that, as well as through finding efficiencies in public spending and increasing taxes on those who can afford to pay the most, is also to have the right economic framework where we will have economic growth.
Well, let me unpick that. There was a lot of detail in that answer. First of all, what are these ideological reasons that George Osborne has to pay down the debt and the deficit so much faster?
Well, certainly since 1979, with the election of Margaret Thatcher, the Conservatives have been hostile to the central state. They believe that the welfare state creates a dependency culture. They believe there's lots of inefficiency and that the private sector would work better. So they've been ideologically committed to privatisation, to marketisation of public services.
And you make that case very well.
And this government has done the same. And despite all the evidence that it doesn't work.
What evidence is it that it doesn't work? I mean, we all remember when the state was running everything, it took 3 weeks to get a telephone installed and none of the public services worked, and you found yourselves with people's bodies queuing up at crematoria. The state wasn't as efficient as the private sector, was it?
Well, I think that it's a gross oversimplification of what happened at
the
time.
It's a 24-minute programme.
There ought to be values of public service. If you take the National Health Service, for instance, this government, because it's committed to marketisation, has made hospital compete against hospital, school against school, and the values of public service, which would underpin education and healthcare in this country, have been eroded. So I want to see, for instance, the integration of health and social care, a truly national system, that locally administered, locally run, that works in the interests of all local people. But there has to be some kind of national coordination over the National Health Service, and the fragmented system between health and social care needs to be integrated.
I want to just get back to this idea of the debt and the deficit. All the parties want to pay down the deficit and want eventually to start cutting down the debt. Why? I ask because I've done a little bit of research attempting to educate myself in this. In 1815, at the year of the Battle of Waterloo, exactly 200 years ago after the Napoleonic Wars, the national debt was running at 200% of GDP, and Britain then embarked on a century of being the richest and most powerful country in the world. Now, national debt is only 64% of GDP. Now, if we were having such a good time at 200%, why are we worried about 64%?
Well, that's a good question. The deficit is a problem, as distinct from the debt, because instead of putting investment into public services, we are paying interest to our creditors. The deficit needs to be reduced in order to pay, so that those interest payments can be reduced.
No, you go on.
Yeah. And again, with the national debt, we want to have an economy which is sustainable, where we are able to grow our own way to recovery, instead of relying on debt, really, when the economy has been over-reliant on debt recently.
Now, you'll make a Keynesian argument here that it's investment, and it's government investment, money brought by taxation that should be invested, and that should in itself reignite the economy, as it were. And that's a Keynesian argument of priming the pump, as it were, putting more money in by state intervention. Now, the deficit itself does that as well, doesn't it? Because by paying that interest, the government is putting money back into the economy. By paying interest out on those gilts and those treasury bonds, as it were, the government is using that technique to reinflate the economy. The deficit's actually quite a Keynesian piece of useful economics, isn't it?
Well, we want the money to be invested in public services and in capital infrastructure rather than in debt repayment. And that's the way to expand the economy.
But what if it goes into debt repayment, then those interest payments on the debt will eventually be spent on things as well, thus creating demand and thus making the money move faster, which is the sign of a successful economy. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I know there must be a flaw, or else I'd be doing this. I'd be Prime Minister.
No, I think that the best way to grow the economy, as I said, is through investment in public services and in capital infrastructure, so that it's to benefit of everyone and not just those who are reaping the benefits and the interest payments that the government is paying at the moment.
We must talk a little bit more about the NHS. The NHS, its funding now is ring-fenced, so that can't be brought down by any of the main parties. And yet the NHS will always continue to cost an infinite amount of money. How much would Labour put in more than it's getting now?
Well, I think the key thing in terms of the National Health Service is the integration of health and social care. That at the moment we have a fragmented system, that there are burdens placed on hospitals because of the lack of adequate social care, and I think we need to rebalance between health and social care, as I said, and integrate them. So people get lost at the moment in the system because there are so many different providers and so many services and so on, and that needs to be integrated to make sure that we care for the whole person.
But would that cost more money?
Well, not necessarily. It's reallocating the money which is there at the moment. I think there's, as I said, to integrate health and social care to get the best value for the care of the individual.
So your difference from the present way that it's being run under the Conservative Liberal coalition is just a difference in manner rather than a difference in philosophy, a difference in ideology, as it were. It's a difference in management.
Well, you say a difference in management or a difference in manner. I think for someone who's struggling to find their way around the care system at the moment, for people who are elderly and struggling to meet their care bills, I think it's much more fundamental than that.
Well, but it is still a managerial thing rather than I mean, if you said we want to spend all the money in the country on the NHS to make everybody immortal, it would be a happy and optimistic aspiration, though impossible. Equally, if you said, no, everybody's going to die anyway, there's no point in spending money on the NHS, that would be an equally persuasive and perhaps slightly harsher and more realistic philosophy. Those would be two different philosophies. I can't see a difference in philosophy between you and the Conservatives on the NHS.
Well, I think there is a difference in philosophy in the sense that before the 2010 election, Cameron said there would be no further top-down reorganisation of the NHS, and has actually created, through Andrew Lansley's reforms, a much more complicated managerial structure. So I think we want to see that stripped away, and, as I said, placing emphasis on care for the whole person. So rather than seeing localism and decentralisation and hospitals competing against hospitals and so on, a fragmented system as we have at the moment, we want much more coordination and control over the whole of the healthcare system to make sure that everyone, irrespective of where they live, get the best possible health care that's available.
Well, every party is going to be wanting that. But is this not a symptom of the current state of British politics in which there really isn't much difference between the main parties? Conservatives, Liberals, Labour all want about 43-45% of GDP to go through the state. That is an expression of that fundamental question of politics. And the only other parties are either nationalists in their identity in various forms in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, or are one-issue parties predominantly defined by a particular stance. Politics has become quite bland. The philosophy has come out of politics. There is a homogenous uniformity to the main parties, isn't there?
Well, I appreciate to members of the public that it very often looks like that. I think politicians are constrained because of the state of the economy, the fact that we have the deficit and so on, as we talked about. But within that, there is the language of priorities, and that is very much about ideological choice. Either you want the kind of society which the Conservatives want to create, which is very individualistic, very unequal, very uncaring in my view, or you want the kind of values that I started talking about at the start of the interview, about equality and a true genuine form of liberty for individuals and a stronger sense of fraternity.
It's almost, it always becomes psychological rather than philosophical. Individualism or that sense of community both have just as powerful arguments to support them, don't they? I want to be part of a community, but I don't particularly want to be told to be part of a community. I want the choice.
Well, to me, politics is first and foremost about values. As I said, the kind of society that we have at the moment, I think, is very materialistic, very greedy, very uncaring, uncompassionate. And it's those kind of issues that I want to address, and the Labour Party is addressing through the sorts of policies that we've outlined.
But that caring and compassion, you think, are things that the government can insist upon?
Well, there's certainly things that don't necessarily happen by themselves, and there's certainly things that the government can try to foster. I'm not saying that they could be imposed from centrally, but it depends. There are policy choices to be had. As I said, do you want a healthcare system that's underpinned by markets and competition, or do you want one which is primarily concerned about care? Do you want schools to be competing against one another, or do you want them to be working in the true interests of education?
I'm told off for it anyway, but I hesitate to quote Edmund Burke to a professor of politics, a teacher of politics, but you know what he said to the electors of Bristol, that it's about a candidate's judgment as much as about agreeing with their policies. Why is it that people find Ed Miliband so difficult to put their trust in?
Well, I don't think they do. I think I voted for Miliband. I'm bound to say that, but it's true. For the leadership contest in 2010, because I thought that out of all the candidates, he was the one that offered the clearest sense of vision going forward. I think he's been putting that vision forward. I think we now have a bold message to give to the electorate. If he was bland and boring and not a serious politician, then why would David Cameron be running away from him in the televised leadership debates? I think Ed has a lot to offer, and he's a right choice for the country in the election this year.
Kevin Hickson, thank you very much for coming
thank you
in.
very much.
I'm sorry that you're all alone and so very lonesome here, but thank you very much for coming in. The others had perfectly good reasons not to be here. Please join me again for the next election special Hot Topic. Until then, goodbye.